Katherine Sugg was professor of English and Latino and Puerto Rican studies at Central Connecticut State University. She teaches and writes on world literatures, Latino and comparative American studies, and film and media. She has also written several journal articles and published a book entitled Gender and Allegory in Transamerican Fiction and Performance.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me, Gil Gelati and Central Authors, and thank you all for joining us today. We have a double feature, so it should be really good. I'm just going to sort of go through some of the material in the preface, and then you can ask me questions later about which films and what I say about them and TV shows in the Q&A if you're interested. We do seem to hear a lot about the apocalypse these days, and I did much of the final writing on heroism and apocalypse in 2020 and 2021 as some terrifyingly real crises unfurled in the U.S. and across the world. And many of us watched in consternation or worse as news and social media videos flooded our screens. And sometimes those images and alarming stories seem to feel and look like many of the apocalyptic stories from film and TV that I explore in the book. And I had a lot of friends say, wow, I feel like your book is happening around me. And I was like, yeah, that's not good. So I've long considered most of these pop culture artifacts to be kind of exaggerated fantasies, though often very informative and entertaining ones. So overall, Apocalypse and Heroism is an effort to smuggle some insights from critical and political theory into a more widely accessible understanding of the aesthetic and generic and genre terms conventions of popular culture and its narratives, along with an exploration of what the mode of allegory and specifically makes possible and how to read it. While much of my focus is on the roles of race and gender in cultural imaginaries and narratives, I also try to show why discussions of neoliberalism, liberal individualism, and political and social histories are useful in thinking about aesthetics and genres in popular culture and narrative, i.e. my own areas of specialization and training. As such, much of my argument regarding the less obvious messages and implications embedded in some of our favorite television series and hit movies is also an engagement with how people experience both media and their own lives, which I and others argue is largely through narrative. My guiding idea was to explore and sometimes critique what appear to be wide attachments to notions that many people, including often myself, still tend to hold, if only unconsciously, about leadership, i.e. the hero, and foundational ideas about individualism and society. Popular genres include many types of stories and images. In recent decades, the apocalypse and other world-shattering crises keep coming into our screens and pulling on our attention. So the book explores what might be learned from the narratives of destruction and visions of rebuilding or saving the world that seem to dominate television, film, and even the news. To consider how contemporary culture seems to love a crisis, I focus on the question of the hero, the figure of that unique individual who will save others in the family, community, nation, or world by virtue of their special capacities. A figure that traditionally and often still is conventionally presented as a white man. The intransigence of racialized and gendered ideas about who can lead and what society and politics are even for took on surreal real-life consequences in recent years. Even before the global COVID SARS pandemic of 2020 and 2021, ongoing, cultural and political commentators worried about the rise of populist authoritarian leaders across the world, and especially in the United States. For example, much of Donald Trump's rhetoric relied on figures of embattled white masculine authority and contempt toward the various cultural and political shifts since the 1960s that have challenged the presumptive superiority of white supremacy and patriarchal traditions. As the analysis of that rhetoric became its own veritable cottage industry, many media and academic commentators noted that the perception of traditional forms of masculinity as endangered or in crisis often translates into a defensive posturing among both individual and political groups. As this perceived crisis results in attempts to shore up threatened masculine authority, often through expressions of power, violence, and superiority, that offend many but resonate with many others, particularly in audience and TV series, audiences of film and TV. And The Walking Dead is one of the focus of one of my chapters, of chapter 3, so that's the attention to the badasses of the zombie apocalypse is one of the things that one talks about. And yet times have indeed changed, and with them, ideologies and stereotypes of race and gender roles and capacities would seem to be outdated, even extinct. Still, in an era of perpetual war, populist authoritarian politics, and superhero blockbusters, it would be hard to deny that the long-standing attitudes associated with gender and race and their role in the narratives and attitudes shaping notions of who and what constitutes a hero or heroism. Such attitudes clearly persist for large segments of both the political and media-consuming populations, but often in ways that are not obvious or expected. Popular culture offers a useful and often very fun opportunity for thinking through these questions about cultural narratives and popular media that manifest deeply held stories and ideas circulating around us and in what we watch. So Heroism and Apocalypse examines the various ways even so-called liberal attitudes towards race and gender remain embedded in economic liberalism, a logics of Western individualism and autonomy that are foundational to widely shared ideas about freedom and the ingredients for good governance, for a good society. I give Roland Emmerich a pretty hard time, and I discuss in the introduction him along with a few other mainstream apocalypses. In these films and TV shows, the stories presume that the apocalyptic crisis is a kind of war for survival that needs a singular leader. I do spend a fair amount of time talking about Hobbes in the introduction. The apocalypse genre thus intensifies and reveals the rationales, both historical and contemporary, that shape the familiar understandings of collective and individual life as guaranteed or saved by just and effective leadership. Although mainstream media often suggests that such leadership requires that some man, usually white, rides in to save the day, the film and television series often emphasize cooperation among a variety of characters and social sectors that distract the viewer away from the central narrative arc, though often bringing us back to it and him in the end, which is kind of what I suggest in Chapter 1 that happens with Children of Men, which is the 2006 film directed by Mexican director Alfonso Cuarón and starring Clive Owen. And this is a very beloved film, so I'm taking on shows and TV films that I actually love as well. So I'm not trying to say everything is terrible, but kind of showing kind of some of the dynamics that lead to this centering of the white male figure in the end or throughout the narrative. So some of the recent TVs and shows and films, however, work to critically expose the violence, exploitation, and even stupidity that can result from too much leadership or sovereign power, particularly when embodied by a white man and his followers who share a blind attachment to notions of survival as a war between good and evil. This becomes the focus of Chapter 3 on The Walking Dead, and even, I argue, in Bong Joon-ho's classic Snowpiercer, one of the films I discuss in Chapter 4. So I argue that the 21st century explosion of apocalyptic genre fiction largely reveals not only persistent ideas about leadership and collectivities, but also the function of race and gender ideologies in those ideas. In many, if not most, of its recent film and television incarnations, the apocalypse narrative operates as an allegory that veers between a recuperation of traditional forms of both leadership and racialized masculinity, but also a critical diagnostic, one that exposes what's gone wrong and sometimes offers new options for a better social order or a better story. And this kind of happens a lot in the conclusion chapter, which is very short, about The Girl with All the Gifts and the discussion of Sleep Dealer, a film by Alex Rivera. While popular culture oscillates on questions of leadership as race and gendered, political culture, at least in the United States, has been slower to consider alternative visions of societal futurity and good governance. Critic John Patrick Leary wrote about 2 years ago that the U.S. that, quote, we live in an anxious society, almost pathologically obsessed with leadership, which he traces to a 19th century hyper-valorizing of, quote, men of industry. This cultural tenet persists in today's middle management, self-help books, and education curriculums. And Leary notes, along with several of my film and television examples, that the traditional criteria of dominant and aggressive masculinity for that top spot has now been softened, sometimes feminized, in recent decades towards a more empathetic version of benevolent world-saving authority. But even these new incarnations of the vanquishing hero play into the myth of what Leary calls, quote, great leaders of men forged in crisis, that persists. In the familiar pop culture incarnations, crises of apocalypse and other large-scale catastrophes cathartically rehearse this desire to be saved. And while the figures who are doing the saving may look like new versions of heroes and heroisms, the belief that the crisis requires an individual great leader indicates how much might remain unchanged. So in terms of allegory, since at least the Christian Bible's book of Revelations, allegory has been understood as a heightened narrative mode that is strongly pedagogical. The apocalypse allegory teaches and reveals a society's faults or sins, which precipitate the apocalyptic event, and then promise that with that society's apocalyptic wiping away, there will be a newly redeemed world, something closer in the Bible to a godly kingdom, and sometimes we have other secular apocalypses now. But some apocalypses demonstrate, as in 2012, which is a Roland Emmerich film from the early 21st century, that the path to redemption can be made, can also be through the restoration of an already familiar social order. Since apocalypse allegories depict the future of humanity and a shattering crisis that threatens its end, the recent popular cultural obsession with apocalypse necessarily indicates these long-held ideas and biases. In our secular age, there are often attitudes or ideologies about politics, governance, and individual and collective merit or capacity. Who counts? Who will survive? In other words, who will be most likely to survive? Many of these popular apocalyptic crises reveal presumptions that weld leadership to older ideas about masculinity and race. And such presumptions have resurged into the national and international media sphere with a startling uptick in revanchist political posturing that often hinges on a gendered rhetoric of strength and power, and a rhetoric that Emmerich's films, for example, sometimes both uphold and inflect with contemporary notions of racial harmony and manly caretaking. So while my main analyses explore the issues of genre, apocalypse, science fiction, romance, horror, and action thriller, dystopia, and even family melodrama are a few I discuss in detail, the considerations of commercial success and global access and distribution are pertinent in several of these cases. I go a lot of American films, but also some international examples throughout. These examples are covered in my chapters, therefore are not avant-garde or art house movies, although a couple were not initially huge hits or have been most popular in university classrooms and academic criticism, all, however, with the possible exception of Sleep Dealer, which is a 2008 film by Alex Rivera that was sort of produced in Mexico and Tijuana, are all pretty widely known and discussed. So I do take a stab at the MCU, the Marvel comic universe, and some of these are kind of controversial among my readers and friends. So both popular audiences worldwide and scholarly debates have taken up the apocalypse as a key contemporary genre, one which seems to have become a permanent fixture in the 21st century. So while the large-scale and devastating destruction of the world is presented in stories and tones that can be variously humorous and terrifying, horrific, or incredibly sad, and why this experience is marketed as entertainment and expected to be so gratifying for a large number of people is actually a serious question I explore in depth. So from the Bible to the imminent apocalyptic wiping away of the modern secular visions of alien invasion, zombie apocalypse, and climate catastrophes, the apocalypse stages cathartically our collective imaginings of decisive and world-changing crises. Ian Kaplan has called this, in terms of climate crises and climate apocalypses, pre-traumatic stress disorder. So this idea that we are sort of advancing or anticipating the terrible end of the world and how to work through it. And this is sort of a mind exercise and narrative that helps us grapple with some of the implications and some of the issues that we're worried about. So when people ask me why the hero or why the apocalypse, I usually answer it's anxiety. You know, fear and anxiety are kind of the motivating narrative engines, I think, behind what we're seeing in pop culture as well as in other areas. So I would kind of wrap up here, and I do talk about the MCU, and I could talk about Civil War briefly, like as an example of one of the takes I have, which is, it looks like it's this multiple it has this formula, which is now very familiar with witty dialogue, expensive special effects, plot twists, and characterizations that express this ironic, self-reflective tone and perspective on the genre. But like other MCU products, Civil War offers, and like other MCU products, Civil War offers an updated view of superhero stereotypes and plot conventions, telling the story of the Civil War between competing visions of freedom and good governance. So the leaders are Captain America, Chris Evans, and Iron Man, Robert Downey Jr. So you have this ensemble cast and a lot of Baroque plot machinations of all the Avengers films that work hard to distract us from the focus on the main storyline that often frames this this crisis of governmentality and leadership as a kind of a white man's burden sort of thing. So while, yes, many of the several key players in the film are women characters, including Natasha Romanoff or Black Widow, and Wanda Maximoff or the Scarlet Witch, played by Elizabeth Olsen, famously in the TV show, as well as 3 black superheroes. And people talk about this as kind of post-racial casting. So the idea that now everything's okay, you have all these figures, these women are doing great things, and the men are, the black men are actually taking on key roles. So this looks really good. Even, that film is when Black Panther with Chadwick Boseman was introduced. think it was like 2016, yeah. In terms of race and gender differences, the presumed functions, the problems, though, raised in the film are most obvious in the plotline that begins with the catalyst for the main conflict. So this is an accident killing innocent bystanders during a mission in Lagos caused by Wanda, the Elizabeth Olsen character, who's not yet learned to properly control or manage her superpowers, a hit given her name, the Scarlet Witch. So Wanda starts off as a sympathetic but rather helpless character who must be protected and managed by some man. Thus, her character begins as a victim of her own powers, which also comes with the suggestions of mental health and stability concerns, and then as something of a rogue villain who must be who may have to be eliminated. And this becomes a big focus in Chapter 2 on Firefly and Serenity, the Joss Whedon sort of cult phenomenon, both a television show and a film. And yeah, it's interesting because it sort of explores how Whedon has gotten in some of the trouble he's gotten in. I don't know how many of you follow these things, but it's a good story. So the notion that a beautiful, vaguely outlaw, and waif-like young white woman is fundamentally unstable plays into long-standing current in gender ideologies and projects all sorts of irrationality onto the feminine, and as I mentioned, is an important part of Chapter 2. So similarly, the main hard decisions for the more sober female figure of Natasha Black Widow concern which leading white male characters she will support and counsel. So Civil War illustrates how this crisis of governmentality and legitimacy that organizes the MCU, and particularly this film, place the women and non-white characters, often themselves heroic figures in the narrative, in roles that ultimately support or confirm decisions made by the centrally featured white men or heroes. I suggest this tendency persists as a cohering narrative element that organizes viewers' relationship to what an apocalyptic crisis threatens or promises, and is evident in both the MCU and other the surge in apocalypse and post-apocalypse films and TV shows. So briefly, I could go through the different chapter organizations. The introduction looks at genre and liberalism, and also kind of the question of the agency or individualism of heroes in their narrative, and sort of talking about like Joseph Campbell and the monomyth, and then kind of going through various examples that are kind of from my own archive of key texts that I keep coming back to, and such as in Children of Men and Mad Max Fury Road, which explicitly criticize or ironize the old versions of white male heroism, but somehow end up sometimes falling back into the generic and ideological pitfalls of neoliberal multiculturalism. So in the chapters 3 and 4, the work of critique shifts to the more pessimistic register of these films and TV shows like The Walking Dead, at least I argue, and Snowpiercer, where I suggest the conventions are hyperbolically invoked to reveal the futility of certain kinds of liberal agency and expose the presumptions of heroic leadership as more of an obstacle than an avenue to better worlds or visions. Then in Chapter 4, along with the conclusion, I talk about sort of the utopic aspects and the speculative aspects of apocalyptic allegories that are created in some of the other pop culture. So in these examples, particularly Snowpiercer and Sleep Dealer and The Girl with All the Gifts, the tension between critique and speculation is explored through rather than against our identificatory, the way we identify with the hero and the leader, attachments to these figures and their roles in the story, which are then kind of exposed in some ways is as a problem for both the story itself and what heroism might ultimately mean. So those are just an overview of some of the things that I do in the book, and it really, as I mentioned before, writing this was like the most fun I've had as an academic scholar until it wasn't. It was just like, and people are like, why? I'm like, both the pace of both apocalyptic popular culture and events, as well as the ways in which this as a topic or an idea in criticism, it challenged my capacities to keep up, so to speak, with events and popular culture and scholarship. But I really thank you for this opportunity to talk about it a little bit, and I look forward to questions.
Questions for Katherine?
Talk fast. Amanda.
I'm just interested in what your selection paradigm was for because there's so many to choose from.
Exactly.
So what made the cut, what didn't, what were the things you were quibbling with?
Some of that comes from just previous scholarly work, and presentations and things, but I wanted to give and the arguments I wanted to make. So yeah, I'm trying to think. There was a transnational interest, and there's some things about global cinema that I drew on, but also wanted it to be popular. So The Walking Dead. So I didn't do Revolution, or I didn't do a lot of other series that I talked about, but you had to, like you said, I had to choose. So I went with the ones that I kind of felt most that I really had a good hold on in that case. And some of the things like The Children of Men and Fury Road, which is the focus of chapter 1, trying to look at what happens when a good white guy, a good leader, and it really is shown, but how does the narrative work with that? And they do different things in the two films, but that kind of comes, like I said, was the argument. So it's like, yes. Professor Spillman, Deb?
Oh, yeah. I'm just really intrigued by how you've kind of like identified apocalyptic narratives as something that have now coalesced as a recognizable genre. And I could be wrong, but like I often associate apocalyptic narratives, especially with ends of the century, like the 1890s, the 1990s. But yeah, it's like we're entering the third decade of the 21st century, and we're still going strong. I'm wondering if there's like any like logic behind why now we can kind of recognize apocalyptic fiction as a genre, and why it's so popular and why it's going so strong today.
Yeah, I mean that's a really great question and kind of a complicated one. So I was influenced a lot. I think. Eric Leanitz recommended Frank Kermode, The Sense of the Ending. So other periods, and then Benjamin, which is something that I keep going back to in The Origins of Tragic German Drama, both talk about the apocalypse as this in terms of allegory in Benjamin. And so it's not always, I know what you mean about the end of the centuries, but these periods of kind of epical transition. So I think, and because this one seems to be elongated, and there's a critic named Lauren Berlant who talks about sort of the impasse that late 20th, early 21st century sort of societal dynamics, or thinking about individuals and trying to think of it in terms of capitalism and sort of where we are, and the idea that we're stalled. And that kind of what you're saying, like now 30 years in? Oh, yeah, we're beginning of the third decade, yeah. And it's, yeah, but that's a great question, thank you. Yeah.
You mentioned Snowpiercer. So, are you interested in how, like, Parasite and Squid Games and all of that is sort of the river's reversed, and the East is influencing the way we handle this, and the West? Or, did you look at that in the book?
I didn't look at Parasite and some of the other things that are coming out of particularly East Asian, Hong Kong cinema, and Korean cinema in particular. But people have talked about, and I do discuss both with Rivera, which is about kind of a speculative, it's more dystopic than apocalyptic, but what would happen at the border if you really shut it down and all the work is done virtually. So it's like this, it told about a young man from Oaxaca who does this kind of Bildens Roman travel to the Tijuana. But in both the cases of Jun-ho and Rivera's work, they are coming from places that are more what would you say, critical and explicit in looking at sort of global capital organization and income inequality, environmental, and in other ways. So I think it's important that, like you say, there's a reversal, and I talk about that a little bit. It's not all coming from Hollywood, and actually the ones that are doing some of the most interesting work are coming from these places that are decentered. But yeah.
So Hollywood, we've got women superheroes, we've got black superheroes, but it's still the white guy who sort of gets the final say, if you will. Do you see? Are we turning a corner, or are we just?
I think it's and one of the things I say in terms of looking at this as good and bad politics or good and bad stories underserves the text themselves and the fun of it. So my editor, who's a good friend, was like, you can't say that about the MCU. You're just wrong. And I was like, okay. And especially with Snowpiercer and some of the other films, like I said, they actually aren't bringing the white guy back, but you keep getting these examples. The Star Wars franchise, for example, we get this great new heroine and the sidekick, and they eventually just got rid of them. Like, they couldn't maintain it. So I think it's varied, and I don't think it's done, but I do think the pieces I look at, and particularly like The Girl with All the Gifts is another zombie apocalypse, and they did a casting decision to have Sania Nanua, who's a young black British actress, really great, play basically the hero is the black zombie girl. And so she does this really interesting, that's really reductive, but she does this, so it revisits the whole notion and then shows us that the story of the white guy who's the sergeant that we think we're watching, nope, they're eliminated, and she the zombies get together, and they're going to be a hybrid, and it's very and some people might find it depressing because, yeah, humanity's pretty doomed. But the zombie kids are really nice. Yeah.
And could you talk a little bit about the kind of just the process of writing the book?
Yeah, this was, it went through a lot of revision and over the years, and I have another project sort of related to it, and they were melded, which was looking at literary incarnations of sort of how narration does consciousness and subjectivity in this kind of mode, and taking apocalyptic, kind of looking at Cormac McCarthy and Roberto Bolaño and some others. So I separated them. And then, and I had colleagues, some of whom are here in the room, who really helped me revise and work through it. And we had a little bit of extra time in terms of getting it to the publisher. But I got the contract in 2016, and it took a lot longer than I expected. But yeah.
Any other questions? Thank you very much, Dr.
Thank
Sugg.
you all.
Great.